how do new technologies shift how power is dealt with in society? So that, short story leads me to being a professor at Cambridge and now running a research center called the Minderoo Center for Technology and Democracy. I also helped direct a new initiative of the UK government called Responsible AI UK, and I sit on a couple of boards of academic and technology initiatives. The stake that I want to plant in the ground really is around some of these key principles that motivate my work. And then the name of the center that I'm so blessed to be able to run, helps to say it all, that it's technology and democracy. So one of the key principles for me around AI and sustainability is, how are we bringing democratic participation and democratic values into the choices that we're making about technology? And I'll just give you a quick drill on that. So one of the 4 key principles of our research center is asking the question, what is the environmental impact of our digital information ecosystem? And that's a hard question to answer. But one of the things that we know very clearly is that A, the environmental impact of large technology firms is increasing. B, that the computing resources that we need to build modern AI systems are growing, not shrinking. These systems are getting larger. And as they get larger, they require more in terms of the data centers that are driving the models, the products, the services that we're all enjoying. So we see this in reports of how companies' water usage, electricity usage is growing. One of the things that my center has done is raise questions of how large technology companies have been interacting with governments around the world in order to buy green power. So the trade-offs there, are we going to use more and more compute to build our technology systems? And are we going to fuel that compute with dirty or clean energy? The trade-off really is, are we using that energy wisely? Are we using our green grid at the moment to build out the systems that benefit society? Nobody is saying, let's throw AI away, never use it, don't do any new development. But what my team are advocating for is to really be thoughtful and to make those choices and decisions with accountability and transparency to governments, to publics, to democracies, etc. So I'll just kind of stop there. I want to make sure that with Sophia, we get back to some of the work that I do on buildings, but I want Sophia to launch that. So I'll stop and let Reid launch into that.
Okay, Sophia, again, the same question to you. Can you please talk about your own professional trajectory and how you engage with sustainability and AI in your work?
Thanks, Gina. Thanks, Reid. It's great to be on in a conversation that is geared towards these issues. When I think back to my UWC story, there's a lot of lines that I can draw back to when I was a student. One of my top experiences at UWC was co-planning the annual student conference. And in that year, like each year, students can elect to focus conversations, panels, workshops around a given topic. And in that year, we chose to focus the theme on ethics and the environment. And that's really been a through line in the work that I've done since. A big flash forward, I'm now an environmental designer. I went to design school for landscape architecture and concurrently have been involved in many climate adaptation efforts and initiatives, in addition to sustainability solutions that relate to the built-in environment. And at the heart of my work is thinking about how we can build a world that is designing with nature and not against it. And I've been incorporating technologies, including AI, into accelerating two things. One is around climate mitigation. So how is the impact of our built environment on the natural world? And there's also a second component, which is around climate adaptation. Right now, I'm working at the U.S. Department of State, which is our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, on strategic management of a global real estate portfolio. There's a diplomatic footprint abroad, and it encompasses our embassies and consulates. And so it's been a really interesting platform to think about how to scale up sustainability efforts and climate adaptation from the vantage point of a constellation of many smaller sites. So we have diplomatic operations in 290 cities around the world. And so thinking about how different sustainability solutions land in different climates, in different cultures, has been a really interesting challenge, and increasingly very much so a set of opportunities. So today I will be speaking outside of my role, not in an official capacity, but would love to dive in deeper on questions related to the full building life cycle of our built environment, everything from real estate acquisition through design and planning, through construction, and into the operations of our built environment. There's been a lot of opportunities to think about how the confluence of AI and emerging technologies can strengthen a lot of the efficiencies within that sector, as well as pose interesting challenges related to how those advancements are being transparent and also accessible across the sector wide. So I'll also be tapping into a fellowship that I completed last year that was part of the Edgelands Institute, which is thinking about how the digitalization of cities is impacting social contracts or the citizen experience of those urban areas. So I'm really looking forward to connecting with questions that are coming from the community. And I'll start off with a question back to Gina. Gina's work is endlessly fascinating. There's one thing that you touched point on in your introductory description, and that was around the digital information ecosystem. And from what I understand, the interesting way to break down a trajectory that's happening is looking at the biosphere versus the technosphere. And I learned recently that there is a greater amount of technosphere than biosphere in the world. You share about how imagined affordances in technologies have implications for societal outcomes. I'd be curious to hear you talk more about that.
That's great. I think I'd push that in two directions. I mean, the stories we tell about the technologies we have around us really shape what people have the capacity to do. And one of the things in my writing on theory about technology is that this idea that technologies are natural, or that we know how to use them, that they present themselves with affordances, just kind of features that spring up fresh out of the box, we know. Those get shaped by a whole lot of different imaginations, right? And it puts us, I think, in closer conversation with how designers in general also think about the work that they do, right? That you imagine what a future can be, and you make it material. I think with our digital ecosystem, we have a really hard time imagining new futures. I don't want to fully say it's been a moment of corporate capture, but it's hard to imagine what the next internet might look like? What would a social media environment that connects people all over the world, what would that look like outside of our current data-driven ecosystem? And so if part of the problem is that we're building more and more to advertise more and more to not get us as societies closer to our net zero and climate goals, then how might we start to imagine what a digital good looks like? What might good digital societies look like? As part of that question, I'm helping to lead a new £4 million research initiative called the Digital Good Network that's helping to raise these qualitative and often normative questions about what do societies want and what is good for whom, and bring that into quantitative social science so that we can begin to measure and create indices that help us imagine those new futures. I'm going to turn a question back to you. So, you know, one of the things that I've been studying, spent the last decade studying, is building information management systems and how they're used as organizing in large building projects, and including consulting to and watching a lot of U.S. Government Services Agency projects. So one of the biggest builders in the United States is the U.S. government and the agency that does that. So my question for you, Sophia, would really be, you know, where do you see hopefulness in the kinds of work that you're seeing on a daily basis? Where do you find hope for how we're building better futures? And you might be on mute.
I think hope really lands on the ground with projects. There's a lot of great examples from my current work where I'm able to see a lot of small projects from start to finish at a global scale, and how there are ripple effects with those individual projects, whether it is incorporating whether it's incorporating nature-based solutions or thinking about how we can have a pulse on our infrastructure and assets in a way that we didn't have before. And so returning back to artificial intelligence and the increasing capacity of having a pulse on the finger, having an ability to gauge what our baseline is for both greenhouse gases and our climate risk or our climate vulnerability profile, and to be able to judge that over time is actually a big paradigm change that's happened within for this industry within the last few iterations of both the government work and private sector. And I think there's a lot of excitement around, as you described, the building information management modeling, or BIM. It's part of a greater trend towards being able to capture or to replicate a physical set of reality within a digital model. It's a big trend, not just for buildings, but for climate modeling in general. So being able to have access not to the past data sets or the past records, historical records of climate conditions, but being able to generate predictive models is huge. And it's something that our team at the State Department has incorporated since 2020. So being on that team and seeing some hope of a climate-informed decision-making at all levels of government and now in industry, and increasingly so actually at the household level. It's something I wanted to bring up today to show that a lot of these technologies around sustainability and climate change are very much gaining momentum at the industry, corporate level, government scale. But I think there's an important discussion too for the individual or household level. So thinking about how can any of us alumni gain access to these types of technologies to inform the kind of everyday choices that we make. Everything from where to buy a house to how do we think about ourselves in relationship to climate change. It's a big hope and ambition I have is for people to really create a new type of relationship with the world, the natural world around them. So everything from learning, okay, what kind of soil is underneath me? Am I in a floodplain? Do I know if I'm sitting at a topographic low point or high point? Everybody today could take a second to think about that, whether you're in your car or your apartment or your house. These are all data points. And when we're thinking about artificial intelligence, the spectrum of resolution in terms of what's possible and how to leverage data is a very interesting moment in time right now, as there's more and more momentum and trajectory for both the technology and all the applications for it as well.
If I can just underscore, and then I'll let Reed ask questions, but this idea almost of enchantment, right? That we can use the data, really complex data communicated well. We can use that data to see the world in new ways. I'm very excited about that. I'm pessimistic that data gets us to decisions, or data gets us to change, and that's where the kind of work that everybody on this call, all of us, do in terms of pushing for continual efforts to make better worlds. So I am incredibly hopeful, like you. I share your optimism in what's possible and what we're seeing, the changes that we're seeing, either in the building sector, the healthcare sector, the retail sector. There's so many, agriculture. There's so many wonderful cases around the world of showing great use cases for how AI technologies are making things better. I will just make a little plug for Women's Day 2022, I believe it was, with UNESCO and the OECD. We released a report on AI and women's work. And the short answer there was we actually don't know the impact on work. We have some good ways that we can think about what we know now, what we know today will change as more tools and services get rolled into the economy. But one of my favorite things of that report were these great case studies from the Global South of here are concrete ways that data-driven AI technologies are helping women in their workplaces, in the formal and informal sectors around the globe. And I find hope in those, but to get there, we actually need the action, the choices, the decisions. We need those to go along with the data.
Very good. Let me just kind of bring us back to another thing. When we're talking about, I guess the scope of the problem of artificial intelligence, and we're talking about the built environment, obviously with structures. But why? Let me go step back. Why are we talking about it, from your opinion? Of artificial intelligence and the environment. Because you were kind of touching upon the data and moving forward and what we can do. But just step it back a bit there, if you don't mind, just addressing that. Why we are talking about it in the first place.
I'll jump. I'm going to be really interested to hear Sophia's question too. I'll jump from my point from again, somebody whose job is both to advocate for better digital societies, better future societies, but also to help make better tech. For me, one of the common tropes, one of the common mantras that I'm pushing up against is that AI will solve the climate crisis. And the scope of the problem is that we've known for at least 40 years that we have change to make, and there hasn't been the political will to make the change that must be done to mitigate the worst of climate impacts. So the scope of the problem for me is that we're increasingly building out systems without a full life cycle accounting of the environmental impact of what those systems are. This is as true for our social media systems as it is for the large language models that have captured everybody's attention in the last year. So one of the kind of pushback and scopes and concerns is, when we're looking at a significant chunk of Western economies being spent on developing new kinds of products and services in the midst of a climate crisis, let's make sure we're being thoughtful about how we're spending our precious compute power. To date, we've thought about compute power and the energy that it takes to make these systems as something of a free good. But increasingly, I think we're going to need to be incredibly thoughtful about how we balance the opportunities that are available for building these systems with the very real climate impacts that they have.
Sophia, your thoughts?
Those are all great points. Gina, I really like hearing you describe how very much that finite resource of computing power is very much akin to how some of us might think about fossil fuels, and how do we transition into a new understanding, a new paradigm of a different set of scarce resources that relate to new economies. Returning back to climate adaptation, climate risk, and thinking about AI potential opportunities as well as pitfalls. Your question is like, why care? Why is this important? And it's important because the scale of the challenge of climate change is really exponential. Scientists are telling us that there's about 22 trillion US dollars in exposure to climate change risks over the next 10 years. And that is just within that scope of climate risk. And so the scale is huge and evolving over time, and our purview and our understanding of it is growing. But one other additional layer to this conversation that we haven't touched on is really the kind of regulation components or policy landscape that is also evolving and catching up with AI development. And so an example that I can point to is really related to the transparency of reporting the methodology of climate risks. One interesting part of my fellowship last year was looking at how in the United States, the Securities and Exchange Commission is adopting policy to address a new era of legal institutional social contracts, really, that will have mandatory reporting for companies related to sustainability and also climate risk. So how are assets at risk to the various natural hazards that are compounded by climate change? And what I found really interesting was that methodology of the climate intelligence that's generating these outcomes isn't a mandatory disclosure item. And so we're quickly evolving in a digital divide where we have different kind of resolutions and pictures of what the future might hold. We're not on the same page. And if we think about the pitfalls that landed us into this very position of greenhouse gas emissions and the scale of it, that transparency element, I think, is extremely important when we're talking about these issues. And so thinking about how there can be competitive advantages for developing solutions, but also understanding how the sum of the parts of the individual solutions that are being populated and created to address climate change can really work together, because that's very much what's needed in facing this challenge.
If I can just draw a line under that, I couldn't agree more, Sophia. And one of the things I think is really interesting is this language of risk is not necessarily a way we as citizens would talk about the climate crisis, but it is absolutely the way to get the attention in certain hallways of decision making. So as long as we have measures of risk that allow us to put monetary value on some of these problems, it allows us then to show that in certain corridors of power. At the center this autumn, we'll be launching a report on venture capital, and can we think about the venture capital community's role in ESG, environmental, social governance reporting and practices. So venture doesn't always take on board these ideas that if you're making startup investments in very young companies, that you have a role to play in watching them grow. Sometimes we wait until they get to be publicly traded companies, and then we say, oh, now they have to write particular kinds of reports about their impact on the environment. But if we can start sooner in that process with the people who are designing their, in our case, sometimes designing their algorithmic processes, their data practices, their where they're locating their compute, where they're drawing their data from. If we can get them started earlier in the process, thinking about some of the environmental impact of those choices, then over the life cycle of the company, we can get better outcomes. So, again, it may not be the first, it's not the storming of the gates to change the climate crisis, perhaps, but it is a way to say, here's a concrete way that we can get people's attention when we draw lines under that concept of risk. Reed, should we go to questions?
Yeah, well, with that, there's two questions in there, and thank you everyone for submitting your questions. The first one kind of touched upon what Sophia said about the digital divide, and then what you had mentioned, Gina, about discrepancies. And Cesar had asked, can AI help or otherwise close the technological gap between the West, USA, Europe, and the developing world? And then after that, there's a follow-up question to the latter part of your conversation. So please, again, everyone, continue to submit your questions via the chat.
Hi, Cesar. It's great to see you. Listen, I think the answer is both and. Yes, and. Yes, I believe, I'm not alone in believing that there's going to be enormous opportunities for people in the quote unquote AI era. The International Labor Organization predicts it will be a net positive in employment growth. Organizations like UNESCO agree. We see, though, there are very clear ways that we need to address today's gaps so they don't get bedded in. They don't end up exacerbating today's inequalities in tomorrow's models and products and services. The thing I'm really worried about here is not the kind of expansion of jobs related to AI and the outside of the West. I see that is coming. The thing I'm really worried about is the doubling down of power. So are we going to see a concentration of power in a handful of companies that have gotten on the front foot to have a little bit of a head start in terms of building the foundational models that become the infrastructure that everybody else uses? That's what I'm worried about. Are we lining up to create tomorrow's monopolies today? And I think we might be. So for me, that's one of the things that raises red flags that I want to see worked on in terms of making sure that we're bringing the world into the opportunities of AI, and that the world is benefiting from the opportunities, not just bearing the costs.
And if I
So-
could add, it's
Please.
almost like a slight shift in the question. Can AI help? Can those who have access to AI help otherwise close the technological gap between the West and the developing world? There's certainly an opportunity for the developing world to bypass or to skip over a lot of environmental impacts, a lot of mistakes, a lot of otherwise conditions that would have benefited from potentially having AI precision. One example industry that comes to mind is smart agriculture, and some of those examples that are being made within that industry when it comes to agriculture in the future, with the compounding impacts of climate change, as well as scarcity and phosphorus and other scarce resources that are inputs to agriculture. What's needed are new technologies that are able to use our scarce resources more efficiently, including water, because farming accounts for about 70% of freshwater use, and 40% of that water can be lost to poor resource management. There's a startup, for example, that I worked with in past eras of my life that was looking at pesticides, a group called Fauna Photonics out of Denmark, and they're using AI and laser scanning to analyze what kind of pests are present within a field. So can we diagnose what exact insect species are within a field, and can we have precision application of pesticides in order to reduce the overall pesticides that we have? These are kind of examples of technologies that are being bolstered by AI. But there's all these possibilities, but the question is who has access to these? And very much agree with what Gina stated about monopolies, and is this creating barriers to entry in a more natural resource scarce world and compounding conditions.
The next question we have is from Flores, and she has 3 points leading to the question. And the last point I really love, which is a reference to the movie The Graduate. But to start from the beginning, it's really too little too late. In other words, how is Miami building like gangbusters when Al Gore was filming An Inconvenient Truth decades ago? Ocean waters were spilling out over storm drains. 2 powerful forces are aligned against meaningful ecological balance measures. Pipelines are still spilling oil over the world. The alarm was sounded 50 years ago with the first serious oil crisis. We should be years further along in alternative energy than we are. The market economy is based on insatiable appetites and waste generation. Plastics, unlike the famous quote in the film The Graduate, is not the future, but the death of the planet. What can AI do about that except manage the crash?
I mean, listen, I can be a pessimist like the rest of you, and you're not wrong, Flores. I mean, there are really big problems. One of the flags I wave is to remind people that we have really good data about a whole host of problems, but data doesn't solve problems, right? People make choices and decisions, and that helps get problems solved. Climate crisis is no different. We've had very good data thanks to the Intergovernmental Panel on the Climate Change, and they're giving us great data. They're giving us the state of the art in science. They've been doing that for years. The co-founders of that won a Nobel Peace Prize for putting that panel together. And yet, we haven't made the right choices. We're not making the choices that get us to mitigation fast enough. So concretely, what can AI do except put a finger in the dike, so to speak? I would say two things. One, we can identify, using large scale data models and using data from sharing data around the world, we can get to identification of problems that can be solved concretely. So, and do I think that AI will be a single answer to mitigating the climate crisis? Absolutely not. But do I think that we don't want to go forward with solutions without the best data possible? Absolutely. So it's almost like I see humans working with advanced technologies to make better and brighter futures as the way we get to change, rather than sitting back and saying, we're going to discover a new solution that's going to save us from the climate crisis because we have new technology. There are some who argue that. That's not me. I'd be interested in Sophia on that one.
I agree that the way that we apply data is critical. In some ways, maybe we have too much data at the moment. The rate of data that we have access to is doubling every year. In a way, it's fascinating to me that these trends are exponential, much like climate change impacts, and the kind of positive feed loop, back loops that exist between both trajectories currently. But I think it's important to situate AI within a larger landscape of technology change, of societal change, and not to give too much power to this short acronym. AI has been around for 70 years, and it's part of a host of advancements that make it possible for new applications. So you can kind of break down that landscape in three categories about why it's even possible to have a climate-informed intelligence for applications in sustainability and climate risk. The first is that disciplinary advancement. AI has been around for a long time, and machine learning as a subset of it has developed, and now we have deep learning. There's also number two, computational advancements that allow us to power and to have things like vision, computer vision, and simulation technology that are able to achieve that kind of predictive modeling that I described before. And there's also a third component, which is the physical advancements. Gina talked about data centers, the ability to store that data, the robotics that are possible that make both data collection attainable, in addition to climate sensors that allow us to have a pulse on what is happening in real time, whether that's for early warning systems, for natural hazards events, or it might also relate to high performance computers. It's a whole landscape, and so I think I agree with Flores too. It's that all of this can exist at once, and I suppose the nuances of that are where the kind of interesting discussion points lie, and I think that AI is one part of the bigger landscape.
No, my mute button wasn't working. So thank you. Again, if anyone has any questions, please enter them into the chat. The next question comes from Malachi King. When I think of AI and sustainability together, I get some sense of additional optimism that we can reach our goals. The first thing that comes to my mind when I think of failure to comply with sustainable practices that take us astray from the goal is mismanagement of policy and faulty policy. What are your thoughts on AI minimizing this, where we can get solid building blocks in terms of policy and consultation to battle this crisis and avoid human error, discrimination, greed, bias, etc., that humans tend to bring?
AI is people. This is a great question, right? Can AI represent the stripping out of all the social human messiness that we have? And the answer is no. I mean, we simply don't. That's just not how we work with new technologies. We're not simply turning over decision-making and political power to the data. And if it were, maybe we would be in a better place. Maybe we wouldn't, but that's kind of the messiness of how we run societies, and I don't see that changing. I will just say that, we know that data about humans is really complicated. I love when people say it's not rocket science. Yeah, it's not rocket science, because there aren't simple answers that we draw a box around, because we're dealing with competing values and different cultures and all of those wonderful things that we all spent years thinking about in our UWC experience. But I think we have to be really cautious that we can think of it as a substitution for human insight and decision making. We have to think of it as a real complement.
Sophia, did you have any additional thoughts?
A kind of concept comes to mind around social contracts. It was the focus of that fellowship that I described earlier. And social contracts are really, there's in political science, there are many theories related to it. I'm sure if Gina has thoughts on it, I would love to hear those too. But I think that it's interesting to think about AI and also other emerging technologies and the potential for power dynamic change through the lens of social contracts, because I think many of these same challenges exist before, and AI as a new tool fits within that larger trajectory. And thinking about how there might be repeating past, that there might be a repetition of the past too. Our social contract theory, is that something you've thought about in your work, Gina? Oh.
Yeah, I think it's not only in the work, but it's also in the policy work that we do in the Minderoo Center. For example, let's just say, I think a great example, and I'm going to dovetail this to a later question too, like the really exciting examples that we see in our own work. About a year ago, we released a report on police use of facial recognition technologies, and particularly live facial recognition technologies in the UK, specifically three kinds of key deployments, taking us slightly off of sustainability. But it's all about social contract, right? London Metropolitan Police set up cameras scanning everyone coming into the Beyonce concert. Is that proportionate? Is that right? Is that part of the social contract? Is that the kind of future we want to live in? They may have had a really good intelligence case that allowed them to say internally to their review boards, we think this use of scanning virtually everyone who comes into a concert is a good idea. We might catch a criminal this way. However, is that part of the social contract that we want, right? Is it the kind of sense of fairness that we have? There's so many other examples that we could go into, I think, as well, in terms of being able to question these models, being able to question whether or not you can be fired by algorithm. This is part of the work that I'm working on with the large trade unions Congress in the UK to help write an AI and employment bill. What kind of social contract do we want around work and AI? And I think these are political questions as much as they are ones that get built into code.
Very good. Well, just because you pigtailed on that later question, Sophia, would you like to share any exciting things that your work examples in your work right now in action?
So one of the projects that I've been working on at the State Department is part of our resilience building capacity efforts. And that's something I can dive into a little bit more. There was an initiative for a long time that was looking at natural hazards that State Department facilities and infrastructures experience, particularly related to seismic threats. But in 2020, I joined the office and we started building up a program on climate resilience. And that took place during the Trump administration in the United States. And that was a really interesting experience advocating for climate change investment and prioritization during an administration where even the word climate change was not in cycle, it was not in circulation. And so I think that is a kind of important point, in thinking about growing polarization and how that kind of connects to, I think, UWC superpowers in a way, being able to really understand different sides, kind of connecting this back to my experiences as a student at UWC. I think that there is, although climate and AI are both very polarizing discussion points at the moment, I think that there is an opportunity to really create bridges and to really bring out the nuances in both these discourses. And so I share this personal experience working on at the State Department because we were able to develop a climate program and integrate a lot of interesting research and development, as well as potential case studies for AI on these very topics. And we were able to do so during a challenging political context. And so being able to learn how to position a potential opportunity as a win-win for a lot of stakeholders, and being able to see the ability for climate to fit into a larger set of agendas and opportunities is, I think, a story that comes to mind right now. We're currently working on mapping a range of sustainability and climate initiatives, and being able to have a real portfolio or global lens to that diplomatic platform is something that's really fascinating. And also there's some public links related to that work if others are curious to learn more about the work of the State Department.
Perfect, thank you. There's a question. I will apologize. There's a couple more questions, but we're almost at the hour. And one of those questions from Aaron's, I don't want to short it. And so if it's one that we can follow up with regards to the art of storytelling and AI and is combining that gathering data. So if Gina and Sophia, if you could follow up via email on that one, we have basically 1 minute left. The other question is can you each suggest a favorite book? Because many people want to know what we can do at home, you know, and what resources we can look at. But I think that was a great question, is if you could suggest a favorite book, ideally in this specific area, but any great book would work. And that's from Elisa.
A Tale of the Dreamer's Son by Preeta, class of, what is that, 94? Read it this summer. It's genius novel, has nothing to do with this topic. Aaron, very quickly, I wrote a chapter on storytelling in a textbook on data science. I think that's the key question. We got to tell better stories. It's all about telling stories. AI will help us tell really good stories about data, but we need to communicate that better. And I'm so grateful for Sophia being here.
Sophia, a book?
There's a long list, but right now The Future We Choose is coming to mind as a kind of general book related to the climate crisis. I'd also offer an app, a mobile app called The Commons, where one can track their carbon footprint in addition to into a book. And it's been really a fun conversation. And thanks, Reed, for bringing us both on. It's been fantastic to learn from the questions and from Gina too.
Well, again, thank you both for taking time out of your very busy schedules to be here with us. We can't thank you enough. And lastly, for everyone else, please just a reminder that complete the survey if you can take a few minutes, and the recording will be attached to that email containing the link to the survey. That will come later in the week. And with that, I thank you both, and I thank everyone who's joined us. Michael, I see you coming on there. Good to see you. And it's just been an absolute pleasure. All right. Take care, everybody, and thank you.